Section 12 of The Man of Genius by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 3. Literary and Artistic Mattoids. Definition: physical and physical characteristics, the literary activity, examples: lawsuit mania, Mattoids of genius, possessio, the decadent poets, Verlaine, Mattoids in art. We have just been considering, in Mad Men, the substantial character of genius under the appearance of insanity. There is, however, a variety of these, which permits the appearance of genius and the substantial character of the average man. And this variety forms the link between madmen of genius, the sane, and the insane properly so called. These are what I call semi-insane persons or mattoids. This variety constitutes, in the world of mental pathology, a particular species of a genius distinguished by Maudsley as odd, queer, strange, persons of insane temperament, and previously by Morel. Le Grand Usual and Schul, Geisteskrankheit, Volume 2, 1880, regard them as hereditary neurotics, Regay as neuropathics, and now many as paranoiacs, a terminology which produces a hopeless confusion. The graphomaniac representing the commonest variety has true negative characteristics, that is to say, the features and cranial form are nearly always normal. Possessio, Cianchetini, F, P, etc. His characteristics are not the result of hereditary. At most, he is the son of a man of genius. Florenz, Bruceus, Spandri, Nestor, etc. This form of aberration is most frequently found in men. I only know of one exception in Europe, Louise Miguel, and appears more especially in great cities, worn out with civilization. The mattoid shows far fewer signs of degeneracy than the insane properly so called. Of 33 mattoids, only 21 show degenerative characters, and of these last 12 had 2. 2 were found to have 3, and there were 2 of 4, and only 1 with 6. Another negative characteristic is the survival of family affection, even that of the human race in general, sometimes reaching such a point as to become exaggerated altruism, though in many cases vanity enters largely into the composition of this virtue. Thus Boscioso thinks of and provides for the well-being of posterity and even of the dead. Thus D loves his wife and grandchildren and constantly works for his family. Cianchetini supported a deaf and dumb sister. Sabarbo, Lazzaretti, Copperpiller adored their wives. In prison, a few days ago, I had occasion to perform the operation of blood transfusion, and wasted much time in trying to find a healthy individual from whom to take the blood. All refused, but a consumptive mattoid, as soon as he heard of the matter, volunteered for the operation, and was overwhelmed with shame when I would not make use of him. They have an exaggerated conviction of their own personal merit and importance, with a peculiar characteristic that this opinion shows itself rather in writing than in words or actions, so that they do not show irritation at the contradictions and evils of practical life. Cianchetini compares himself to Galileo and to Jesus Christ, but sweeps the barrack stairs. Passanante proclaims himself president of the political society while working as a cook. Mangione classified himself as a mattoid to Italy and to his own genius, yet he condescended to act as a broker. Cassant claimed to be a cardinal, but in the meantime he was a clever parasite, and made large profits through his very insanity. The shepherd Blewett believed himself to be an apostle and counted permission, and, like the author of Scottatinge, deigned to address himself to none but royal personages. Yet he did not refuse to carry on the trade of a horsebreaker. Stewart, the eccentric author of the new system of physical philosophy, who travelled all over the world to discover the polarity of truth, asserted that all the kings of the earth had entered into alliance to destroy his works. He therefore gave the latter to his friends, with the request to wrap them up well, and bury them in remote localities, never revealing the latter except on their death-beds. Martin Williams, brother of that Jonathan Williams, who in an attack of insanity set fire to York Minster, and of John Williams, who struck out a new line in painting, published many works to prove the theory of perpetual motion. After having convinced himself by means of 36 experiments of the impossibility of demonstrating it scientifically, it was revealed to him in a dream that God had chosen him to discover the great cause of all things, and perpetual motion, and this he made the subject of many works. These persons would not come under the heading of Mattoids, even in their writings. The earnestness and persistence in one idea which make them resemble the monomaniac and man of genius were not often associated with the pursuit of absurdity, continual contradictions, and the prolixity and utility of insanity. One tendency overpowers all others, one which we find predominant in insane genius, viz. Personal vanity. Thus out of 215 Mattoids, we find 44 prophets. Philopanti, in the Dio Liberale, places his father Berillo, a carpenter, and his mother Berilla among the demigods. He discovered 3 atoms, and gives a minute narrative, year by year, of the actions of each. Cordigliani prepared to insult the Chamber of Deputies in order to obtain an annuity from the government, and thought this action much to his own credit. Gratau thought he was saving the Republic by the murder of the President, and had himself called a great lawyer and philosopher. In the same way, Bazzanante, after having preached the abolition of capital punishment, condemns the guilty members of the Assembly to death, and, having given orders to respect the forms of government, insults the monarchy, makes an attempt at regicide, and proposes to abolish all ministers and hypocrites. A physician, S., prints a statement that blood-letting exposes to an excess of light. Another announces in 2 thick volumes that diseases are elliptical. Critics have said, referring to the works of demons, that his dialectic quintessence and sextessence are a true quintessence of absurdity. Gleases affirms that flesh is atheistical. Fusi, a theologian, asserts that the menstrual blood has the property of quenching conflagrations. Hannequin, he used to write in the air with his fingers, and had an aromal trumpet, by means of which he communicated with the spirits dispersed through the air, declares that in the future age many men shall become women and demigods. Henrion, in the Académie des Inscriptions, advanced the theory that Adam was 40 feet in height, Noah 29, Moses 25, etc. Leroux, the celebrated Paris deputy, who believed in metapsychosis and the Kabbalah, defined love as the identity of the reality of a part of the totality of the infinite being, etc., and wished to insert the principle of the triad in the preamble of his constitution. Askill maintained that men might live forever if only they had faith. It is true that here and there some new and vigorous notion emerges from the chaos of such minds, because the only symptom of genius developed in them by psychosis is less degree of aversion to novelty, or, to employ my own terminology, of messianism. Thus, for example, amid the most absurd opinions, Cianciattini had some very fine passages. All animals have the instinct of self-preservation, with the minimum fatigue of escaping from troublesome thoughts and of enjoying the delights of life, and to obtain these things, liberty is indispensable to them. All animals except man gratify and always have gratified these instincts, and perhaps will always continue to do so. Mankind alone, constituted as a society, find themselves fettered, and in such a way that no one has ever succeeded, not merely in bringing them into a state of peace and liberty, but even in showing how they may attain this end. Will I propose to demonstrate this proposition, as a locked door cannot be opened without breaking it, save by means of a key or a picklock, so as man has lost his liberty by means of the tongue, nothing but the tongue, or its equivalents, can set him free without injury to his nature. Amid the doggerel jargon of the Scottadinge, I find this beautiful line on Italy. Padrona sciava sempre e ficli tua nemica. We shall see in Pessanante's biography that sometimes in his writings, and still more in his speeches, he struck out vigorous and original ideas which, in fact, led many persons into error as to the nature and reality of his disease. I may mention the sentence, where the learned lose themselves, the ignorant man may triumph, and another, history learnt from the people is more instructive than that which is studied in books. Lewis distinguishes the maid from the virgin, in that the first has the will for evil without the power, and the second has neither the power nor the will. It is natural that Mattoids should repeat in their conceptions the ideas of stronger politicians and thinkers, but always in their own way and always exaggerated. Thus Bosisio exaggerates the delicate consideration of our lovers of animals, and anticipates the ideas of Millet, Clemens Royer, and Comte on the necessity for the application of the Malthusian theory. In the same way, De Tomasi, a dishonest broker, discovered a practical explication, except for the morbid eroticism which he added to it, of the Darwinian system of natural selection. Cianciattini wishes to put socialism into practice. But the stamp of insanity is evident, not so much in the exaggeration of their ideas, as in the disproportion of the latter among themselves, so that, from some well-expressed and even sublime conception, we pass suddenly to one which is more than mediocre and paradoxical, nearly always opposed to the received ideas of the majority, and at variance with some position and education of the other. In short, we have by that means of which Don Quixote, instead of extorting admiration, makes us smile. Yet his actions in another age, and even in a different man, would have been admirable and heroic. In any case, among Mattoids, traits of genius are rather the exception than the rule. Most of them show a deficiency rather than exuberance of inspiration. They fill entire volumes without sense or savour. They eke out the commonplaceness of their ideas and the poverty of their style with the multiple points of interrogation and exclamation, with repeated signatures, with special words coined by themselves, as in the habit of monomaniacs. Thus Menck already observed that some Mattoids contemporary with himself had invented the words derapti felisan. Berbiguer created the word farfiderism, a monomaniac. Le Barrière wrote a work entitled Dominatmos Heseri, intended to show farmers how to attain double harvests, and sailors to avoid storms. He entitled himself Dominatmospheri Fativer. Cianciattini invented the traverso of the idea. Parry invented Cafangalia and Morbozu, and we owe to Waldock Elytrologia and Anthropomognotologia, and to G. Lepidermocrinia and Glesostomopactica. We often find an eccentric handwriting, with vertical lines cut by horizontal ones, and transverse furrows, even with unusually formed letters, as in Cianciattini. They frequently introduce drawings into their sentences, as if to heighten their force, thus returning, as we've already seen to be the case with megalomaniacs, to the ideographic writing of the ancients, in which the figure served as a determining symbol. Waltuck published 2 books on psychology, a new kind of philosophic system which, however, has found a serious commentator in the same philosopher, which speaks volumes for the seriousness of some philosophers. According to this system, ideas are represented by so many images impressed on each of the cerebral convolutions. Thus a symbol of physics is a lighted candle, that of electrology, or the faculty of judgment, is the nose, or the sense of smell, of ethics a ring, and of motion a fishing hook. The author, despairing, and with good reason, of making himself understood in words, philosophizes with his pencil, and has crammed his book with diagrams of brains covered with such figurative signs. In order to prove the applicability of these principles to literature, he has presented us with a tragedy, Job, in which the characters have their heads covered with similar signs, and chant verses worthy of the system, e.g., "O that I could separate the 2 united conceptions of myself and impiety, I am just, Satan is impious." The Jesuit missionary Paoletti wrote a book against St. Thomas, and illustrated it with a drawing of the vessels used in the tabernacle, so as to determine the future condition of the sons of Adam with regard to predestination. The divine and human wills are figured as 2 balls revolving in opposite directions, and finally meeting at a common centre. The titles of all their works show an exuberance which is really singular. I possess one of 18 lines, not counting a note included in the title page itself, and intended to explain it. A socialistic work published in Australia by an Italian, and in pure Italian, has a title arranged in the shape of a triumphal arch. It is precisely on the title page that nearly all of them at once betray the taint of madness. This example, from the work of the Mattoid de Mons, will suffice. The demonstration of the 4th part of nothing is something. Everything is the quintessence extracted from the quarter of nothing and that which depends on it, containing the precepts of the holy, magic, and devout invocations of demons, to discover the origin of the evils which afflict France. Many have the crotchet of mixing up with their sentences a accumulated series of numbers, which is also sometimes done by paralytics. In a mad production of Sauvbirez entitled 666, all the verses are accompanied by the number 666. This strange thing is that, at the same time, a certain Porter, in England, had published a work on the number 666, declaring it the most exquisite and perfect of numbers. Lazaretti, too, had a singular partiality for this number. Spandry, Levron, and C. have a similar preference for the number 3, a special characteristic found in Mattoids, and also, as we have already seen in the insane, is that of repeating some words or phrases hundreds of times on the same page. Thus, in one of Passanante's chapters, the word reprobate occurs about 143 times. Some have had special paper manufactured for their works, like Woman, who had it made with different colours on the same sheet at an enormous increase of expense, so that a volume of 400 pages cost him over 2,200 sterling. Philon had every page of his book on a different colour. Another characteristic is that of employing an orthography and calligraphy peculiar to themselves, with words in large type or underlined. They will sometimes write even private letters in double column, or with vertical lines traversed by horizontal and sometimes by diagonal ones. They sometimes underline one letter in preference to others in the same word, Passanante, or they write in detached verses like those of the Bible, or introduce points after every 2 or 3 words, as in the MS, in my possession, of a certain bellone, or parenthesis, or even one within the other, as Madrol used to do, or notes upon notes, even in the title page, as in the case of Cass and of La. The latter, a university professor, in a work of 12 pages, has 9 consisting of notes alone. Hepane invented a physiological language, which consists in the main of our own letters reversed, and of numbers used in their places. Many have a calligraphy quite peculiar to themselves, close, continuous, with lengthened letters, and always extremely legible. Many, like some of the insane, whom they surpass in this point, continually intersperse their conversation with puns and plays on words. A certain Jasio wished to prove the analogy of the hand and the week in which God created the world, by means of a pun on the words main and semaine. Eckhart, who had himself said that it is the peculiarity of the insane to occupy themselves with useless trifles, wrote the biography of the madman of Valenciennes, and the strange book entitled Anagrammata Poema N. 7, Chance, 95th edition. As a matter of fact, it was the first. Rev cor et orgamenti a anagrammatopolis la an 14 de l'ère anagrammatique Valenciennes, 1821. 16. The book was almost entirely composed of inversions of words. The following is an example. Lectur il sit que gevus dis, quile sbier fera labruis, quile dupier est sans pedur, que on put macula sans clameur, la nomade amis la modone, et la paterne de Petron, quint le grand dacier etat diacre, le cafir cultiver du fiacre. And so on for 12,000 lines, concluding with this. Moi givas portia mon repos. Here it is well to note that, on the margin of a copy of the Anagrammata belonging to the Bibliothèque Nationale of Paris, is the first confession in the author's handwriting. Anagrams are one of the greatest inanities of which the human mind is capable. One must be a fool to amuse oneself with them, and worse than a fool to make them. This is a correct diagnosis of his case. Felopanti, in the Dio Liberale, explains Luther's propaganda by a caprice on the part of the deity who caused Marge to become a monk. The latter thus became Martin, and then Martin Luther. The origin of Gleese's vegetarian mania was a dream which he heard a voice crying in his ears. Gleese's means Église. He thus thought to himself, suddenly appointed by God to preach his doctrine to mankind. Domonian has the plague decapitated. Take away his head from hence. I fear that his head will deprive my people of their heads by a new mischief. But a still more prevalent characteristic of the singular copiousness of their writings, Blue had left behind no less than 180 books, each more foolish than the other. We shall see how Mangion, who in addition was crippled in one hand and could not write, deprived himself of food to defray the cost of printing, and sometimes spent more than 100 scudi per month to enable him to gratify his taste for authorship. We know how many reams of paper Passanante covered, and how he attached more importance to the publication of a foolish letter of his than his own life. Guitiao used so much paper as to incur a considerable debt in which he was unable to pay. The list of George Fox's works is so long that the Bibliographica Lowndes does not venture to give it. Howard Lance's essay on Tournay consists of 117 volumes. Sometimes they content themselves with writing and printing their vagaries, and make no attempt to diffuse them among the public, though they assume that the latter must be acquainted with them. In these writings, apart from their morbid prolixity, let it be noted that the aim is either futile or absurd, or in complete contradiction with their social position and previous culture. Thus two physicians write on hypothetic geometry and astrology, a surgeon, a veterinary surgeon, an obstetric practitioner on aerial navigation, a captain on rural economy, a surgeon on therapeutics, and a cook on high political questions. A theologian writes a treatise on menstrua, a carter on theology. Two porters are the authors of tragedies, and a custom house officer of a work on sociology. As in the subjects chosen, an examination of 186 insane books in my collection gives the following result. 51 deal with personal topics, 36 are works on medicine, 27 are works on philosophy, 25 contain lamentations, 7 are dramatic, 7 are religious, 6 are poetry, 4 are on astronomy, 4 are on physics, 4 are on politics, 4 are on political economy, 3 are on rural, 2 are on veterinary medicine, 2 are on literature, 2 are on mathematics, 1 is on grammar, 1 a dictionary. I do not count miscellaneous works such as controversial treatises, essays on mechanics, studies in magnetism, funeral orations, eccentric theological works, researches in literary history, proclamations, matrimonial advertisements, etc. Some statistics compiled by phrenologist gives a list of such books known in Europe, which are thus classified: Theology 82, Prophecy, Esoteric Mysticism 44, Philosophy 36, Politics 28, Poetry and Drama 9, Languages and Grammar 8, Erotic Literature 5, Hieroglyphics 3, Astronomy 2, Aeronautics 2, Chemistry 1, Physics 1, Zoology 1, Strategy 1, Chronology 1, Hygiene 1, Pedagogy 1, Archaeology 1. While poetry prevails among the insane, theology and prophecy predominate in the Mattoids, and so on in diminishing proportions for the more abstract, uncertain, and incomplete sciences, as we may see by the scarcity of the naturalists and mathematicians. It is well to note the small number of atheists, 3 only, amidst such a swarm of theologians and philosophers, 162. Spiritualism, on the other hand, is so much in favor that phrenologist gave up the task of cataloguing the works which treated of it. All topics are welcome to Mattoids, even those most foreign to their profession or occupation, but they are found to choose by preference the most grotesque and uncertain subjects, or questions which it is impossible to solve. Such are the quadrature of the circle, hieroglyphics, exposition of the apocalypse, air balloons, and spiritualism. They are also fond of treating the subject most talked of, what one might call the questions of the day. Speaking of demons, who has already been mentioned, Naudier said, "He was not a monomaniac, very much the contrary. He was a many-sided madman, always ready to repeat any strange thing that came to his ears, a chameleon-like dreamer who insanely reflected the colours of the moment." Thus, at the time of our great national deficits, projectors appeared by the dozens, with proposals to restore the Italian finances, either by means of assignats, or by the spoliation of the Jews or the clergy, by forced loans, etc. Later on came the social and religious program, Passanante, Lazzaretti, Bosisio, Cianciattini. At the present moment, the question most under discussion is that of the pellagra. Thus we have, among others, Paris, who has discovered the cause of disease in certain fungi, which fall from the roofs of dirty huts into peasants' food, and make them ill. The proof is evident. Photograph the section of a hut, and place it under the microscope. and you will find, on comparison, that fungi are more numerous than in townhouses where pellagra is unknown. But why do these fungi produce the pellagra? The reason is very simple. These fungi contain the substance fungina, which burns at 47 degrees Celsius. Now when the outside temperature is at 13 degrees and the body at 32, the two quantities of caloric are added together and we burn. This is why sufferers from the pellagra appear scorched by the sun. It is noteworthy that in nearly all Positio Cianciatini Personate Magione de Tomasi B, the convictions set forth in their written works are exceedingly deep and firmly fixed. They show as much absurdity and prolixity in their writings as they do common sense and prudence in their verbal answers, even rebutting objections with a single monosyllable, and explaining their own eccentricities with so much good sense, and sometimes acuteness, that the unlearned may well take their fancies for wisdom, while later on they relieve their insane impulses by covering reams of paper. The Guardian is a true sentinel of the people and government. Liberty, the circulation of the press, was a sentence of Passanante's, which at first seems a mere play on words, but he explained it to experts in these terms. The liberty of the press, the free circulation of journals, constitute a surveillance over the rights of the people. When he asked Positio why he was so eccentric as to wear sandals and walk about bareheaded and half naked in the heat of July, he replied, to imitate the Romans, and to keep the head healthy, and lastly, to call public attention to my theories by some verbal sign. Would you have stopped to speak to me if I had not been dressed like this? Moreover, Mattoids, the verse being the case both with genius and insanity, are united by common interest and sympathy, and above all by hatred to their common enemy, the man of genius. They form a kind of Freemasonry, all the more powerful that it is irregular, founded on the common need of resisting the ridicule which inexorably attacks them on every side, on the need of extirpating, or at least opposing, their natural antithesis, genius. Though hating one another, they are firmly united, and though they do not enjoy one another's triumphs, they rejoice in common over the victims who never fail to fall to the lot of one or the other. For as we have seen, the vulgar, called upon to choose between the Mattoid and the man of genius, never hesitate to sacrifice the latter. Even at the present day, many practitioners who take the dosimetricians seriously laugh at homeopathy, and the academic multitudes who laugh at the Schliemann and Article never treated the archaeological discoveries of Father Secchi in the same way. This is also shown by the emphatic and senseless address presented to Coccopelio and Sbarbaro by many individuals who were still more insane than their idols. This explains why, in spite of the fact that universal suffrage was introduced under the Roman Republic of 1849, the populace never thought of electing Cesare to the Parliament. Cesare was a rough working man, but he was sane. One characteristic which further distinguishes Mattoids from criminals, and from many of the actually insane, is the extreme abstemiousness, which sometimes equals the excesses of the early Cenobites. Positio lived on polenta without salt, Passanante on bread only, Lazzaretti often on nothing but a few potatoes, Mangione on peas, beans, rice, etc., at 13 sous a day. This may be explained by their finding sufficient support and comfort in their own grotesque lucubrations, as is the case with ascetics and great thinkers. And besides, being usually poor, they prefer to spend their small means in securing the triumph of their ideas rather than in satisfying their stomachs. All the more so as nearly all of them, Cianciatini, Positio, F., for instance, were scrupulously honest and almost excessively methodical, keeping account even of scraps of waste paper, which they catalogued with singular order. In short, such men, certainly insane in their writings, and sometimes as much so as any patient in an asylum, are scarcely so in the ordinary acts of life, in which they show themselves full of good sense, shrewdness, and even a sense of order, so that they are quite the reverse of men of real genius, especially those inspired by madness, whose ability in literature is nearly always in inverse proportion to their aptitude for practical life. This is how it happens that many authors of medical eccentricities are practitioners of great repute. 3 such are directors of hospitals, the author of the Scottitange, is a captain and a commissariat officer. Another, the inventor of almost prehistoric machines, and author of works which are more than humorous, fills an office which exposes him to continual contact with cultivated men who have never suspected him of madness. 5 are professors, 2 of whom are attached to a university. 3 are deputies, 2 senators. 1 is a councillor of state, 1 a councillor of prefecture, and another councillor of the Court of Cassation. 3 are provincial councillors, and 5 priests, and nearly all of them are of advanced age and respected in their vocations. Frécot was mayor of Heslop. Leroux and Asgill were members of Parliament. Mattoid theologians, Simon Morin, Le Breton, Geoffriot, Valli, Fenini, have unfortunately been taken so seriously as to be burned alive or hanged. Joris's bones were burned with his writings under the gallows of Bale. Kelly was beheaded for the sole offence of having corrected Joris's proofs. We shall see in the following chapter how many others, Smith, Fourier, Klenov, Fox, found fanatical followers. That calmness, in spite of obstinate persistence in a delusion, which distinguishes them from more ordinary insane patients, may also be observed in monomaniacs, even in their most prominent characteristic, and is not rarely found in some of the stages of inebriety. But precisely as in the ordinary insane, so also in Mattoids, the calm sometimes suddenly ceases, and gives place to impulsive forms of mania and delusion, especially under the stimulus of hunger or irritated passion, or during the return of the various neuroses which accompany and often generate the disease, as in the case of Cordigliani and Mangione. This is why it is important to note that many are subject to symptoms which indicate the pre-existence of disturbance of the nervous centers. Giraud and Spandry have convulsive movements of the face, lowering of the right eyebrow, and ptosis on the right side. Anesthesia was found in Lazzaretti, Mangione, and Di Tomasi. Delusions of short durations in Cordigliani. P., a young man of distinguished abilities, became Mattoid early after an attack of typhus fever. Coleman became a prophet at 18, after suffering from disease of the brain. These impulsive outbursts make such cases extremely important to alienist physicians, who, finding no similar cases in any of the better-known forms of mental disease, often erroneously infer imposture or soundness of mind, and still more to politicians, who, by not at once placing such men, at first it is true, far more ridiculous than dangerous, in asylums, expose themselves to perils perhaps greater than those threatened by actual madmen, who betray themselves at once, thus making it possible to take measures for rendering them harmless. There is a much more dangerous variety of these graphomaniacs, those whose disease was formerly known as lawsuit mania. These individuals feel a continual craving to go to law against others, while considering themselves the injured party. They display an extraordinary activity, and a minute knowledge of the law, which they always try to interpret to their own advantage, heaping up petition on petition, memorial on memorial, in such quantities as is difficult to imagine. Many attach themselves to some person to obtain whose influence they are continually scheming, then they apply to the king or the parliament. They are apt to succeed at first, especially with members of parliament, or at least to be considered merely as overzealous suitors. At last, however, when their persistence has wearied every one out, they convert their forensic and literary violence into deeds, certain that everything will be pardoned them in consideration of the justice of their cause, nay, that their action will have the effect of deciding the suit in their favour. The result, to tell the truth, sometimes ensues, thanks to the institution of the jury. Thus G, having lost his cause, shot at and wounded Count Colli, but was acquitted through the singular eloquence he displayed before the jury. 10 years later, he forced his way armed into an apartment which he had already sold, and which, nevertheless, he insisted on having back. As the erotomaniac falls in love with an ideal person, and imagines himself loved by one who has never even seen him, so they can see no aspect of the cause but their own, and the lawyers and judges who do not support them become enemies on whom they concentrate the fiercest hatred, and whom they look on as the cause of every misfortune that may befall them. It is not rare to find them constituting themselves judges in their own cause, pronouncing sentence on their own responsibility on their adversaries, and sometimes going the length of executing the same. A certain B, from whom the parish priest had taken a field by a perfectly legal and regular contract, took it into his head that he had the right to assault all the priests of his village, because, he said, Catholicism is in opposition to the government. For the same reason he tried to burn down the church, and all this after a series of lawsuits and proclamations. Very just, it may be conceded in principle, but certainly not in application. These persons have, too, a similar kind of handwriting, with very much lengthened letters, and they likewise abuse the alphabet. Their theme, however, is confined to their immediate circle, and they show more violence in dealing with it. They only touch by rebound, as it were, on social and religious questions. Yet the personal litigations of many of these suitors are mixed up with political differences, and this is the kind from which most danger is to be expected in our day. These are usually individuals whose scant education and extreme poverty do not allow them to air their ideas in print, so that they have to relieve their feelings by deeds of violence. Such was Sandon, who caused such annoyance to Napoleon and to Billiot, and was a genuine political Mattoid. Such too were Cordigliani, Passanante, Manguion, and Gotau. Krafft-Ebing speaks of a man who had founded a club of the oppressed for the assistance of those who could get no justice from the courts, and forwarded its rules to the king. Mattoids of genius. Not only is there an imperceptible gradation between sane and insane, between madmen and Mattoids, but also between these last, who are the very negation of genius, and men of real genius. So much so that among my collection there are certain individuals I find a difficulty in classifying. Such, for instance, is Bocciccio of Lodi. El Bocciccio of Lodi, 53 years of age, has one cousin, a cretin. His mother is sane and intelligent, his father intelligent, but given to drink. He had 2 brothers who died of meningitis. As a young man he became a revenue officer, left his native town in 1848, and when nearly dying of hunger at Turin, threw himself from a balcony and broke his legs. Having obtained promotion in 1859, he fulfilled his duties in a satisfactory manner up to the year 1866, when, though still showing intelligent accuracy in his duties of his office, he began to perform eccentric actions, especially inexplicable in a member of the bureaucracy. Thus, one day, he bought all the birds for sale in the village of Baselengo, and then opened their cages and set them at liberty. He took to reading newspapers all day long, and began to send energetic protests to the government, petitioning them to put a stop to the disforesting of the country, the massacre of birds, etc. Being dismissed from his post with a meagre pension, he suddenly gave up all the luxuries of life, and took no food but polenta without salt. He left off, one at a time, all his clothes except shirt and drawers, and spent all his scanty means on the purchase of books and papers, and in publishing works on the regeneration of posterity, which he distributed gratuitously. Criticisms on My Times, The Cry of Nature, and 113 of The Cry of Nature. To anyone who studies these books, and still more to one who hears him talk, it is evident that he has worked out on his own head a system not entirely illogical. We suffer loss, he says, though to grape disease, through the diseases among the silkworms and crabs, through floods. All these things are caused by injury done to the globe through the destruction of forests and the extermination of birds, and, this is where we first perceive his madness, the torture inflicted on it by the railways which pass over its surface. In economical matters we are doing equally ill. By raising ruinous loans we are compromising the future of that posterity whose champion he has appointed himself. Add to this, he continues, that the ancient Romans took much exercise, and not the luxury that we have, and did not take coffee. All these things compromise posterity, because they ruin the germs of humanity, and what ruins them far more is the ill treatment of women, marriages for the sake of money, and certain forms of ill-judged charity. Unhappy children, crippled or consumptive, are kept alive, who, if killed in time, will not reproduce themselves, and in the same way, if, instead of keeping sickly individuals alive in hospitals at great trouble and expense, people were to help the strong and healthy when they fall ill, the race would be improved. And thieves and murderers, are they too not sick men who ought to be exterminated, if the race is not to be ruined? How deadly and bestial is human greed! Everything is neglected for the sake of satisfying the appetites without a thought for the fate of the generations who are to succeed us. The ill-omened mania for procreation, which is inexorably precipitating all nations into an abyss whence one can see no outlet, and which arrested the attention of Malthus, reminds me of the story of Midas, who asked of a god that everything which he touched might turn to gold. The divinity consented, but his first transports of joy were followed by grief and despair. As his very food being changed to gold, he saw himself condemned by himself to die of hunger. I think there could be no better example than this to prove the existence of an active and powerful mind, unsound on a single given point. Anyone who knows the writings of Clemens Royer and Comte will, in fact, find nothing insane in these ideas of Boccicio's, except his refusal to eat salt, which he scarcely justifies by adducing the example of savages who are strong and healthy without it. His notion of railways ruining the globe, and his very airy fashion of dress. For this last whim, however, he gives a tolerably good reason, by alleging the example of Roman simplicity, and by the assertion, not altogether without foundation, that the wearing of the hat tends to promote baldness. Moreover, he observed, very justly, that without these eccentric habits he would be unable to gain a hearing and promulgate his ideas. A truly morbid symptom, however, is to be found in the fact that he based all his conclusions on the information gained from political journals, poor material indeed for study. However, he justified himself thus: "What can I do? They are modern studies, and I cannot do without them, much as I dislike them, as I have no other means of gaining information about mankind." But the point where his insanity comes out most clearly is in the importance attached by him to the slightest fact gathered up in these sweepings of the political world. If a child falls into the water at Lisbon, or a lady sets her skirts on fire, he immediately infers from these facts the degeneracy of the race. The student of hygiene must be astonished at seeing a man retain robust health, and Boccicio walks his 20 miles a day on unsalted polenta. The psychologist cannot refuse to recognize in this case that madness acts like leaven on the intellectual powers, and excites the psychic functions so as almost to reach the level of genius, though not without traces of disease. It is certain that if Boccicio had been a student of law or medicine, instead of a poor exciseman, and had been grounded in the culture which he only gained at haphazard, and under the influence of mental disease, he might have become a Clemens Royer, or a Comte, or at least another Fourier, for his philosophic system is, in the main, similar to that of the latter, except for the peculiarities engrafted on it by mental aberration. But when we think of the integrity of his life, the method and order to be perceived in all his affairs, we can dismiss him merely as a man of unsound mind. And when we remember the relative novelty of his ideas, can we confuse him with the many absurd Mattoids already described? Certainly not. Let us suppose that Giuseppe Ferrari, instead of a superior culture, had only received Boccicio's education. We should certainly have had, in place of a savant justly admired by the world, something similar to Boccicio. Certainly indeed those symptoms of historical arithmetic, with kings and republics dying on a fixed day at the will of another, can only belong to the world of mental alienation. The same thing might be said of Michelet, if one thinks of his fancy natural history, his academic obscenities, his incredible vanity, and the latter volumes of his History of France, which are nothing but a tangled thicket of scandalous anecdotes and grotesque paradoxes. So too of Fourier and his disciples, who predict the mathematical exactness that 80,000 years hence man will attain the age of 144, that in those days we shall have 37 millions of poets. Unhappy world. Likewise 37 millions of mathematicians equal to Newton, of Le Mercier, who along with some very fine dramas wrote some in which speeches are assigned to ants, seals, and the Mediterranean, and of Boccacio, who asked painters to depict for him an earthquake in the air, and describes a mountain giving a pair of spectacles to a bell tower. The same is true of the heir of Confucius, the astronomer who created the Dio Liberale, of the pseudo-geologist who had discovered a secret of embalming bodies which might be known to any assistant demonstrator of anatomy, and who believes that the world can be purified by cremation. In Italy, a man has for many years been a professor in one of the great universities who, in his treatises, created the nation of the Cagots, and suggested a certain instrument for resuscitating the apparently drowned, which would have been enough to suffocate a healthy person. Another talked of baths at the temperature of minus 20 degrees Celsius, and the advantages of seawater owing to the exhalations of the fish. Yet these volumes contain some very fine things, and have reached a second edition, and none of his colleagues ever suspected that his mind was not perfectly sound. How is he to be classified? He occupies a middle place between the madman, the man of genius, and the graphomaniac, with which last he has in common the stability of his aims, and his calm and persistent search after paradoxes. Italy, for the rest, as I have shown in Tre Tribuni, has had and idolized for a brief quarter of an hour two Mattoids of considerable gifts, Concapellier and Sparbaro, who, in the midst of immoralities, trivialities, contradictions, and paradoxes, had a few traits of genius, explicable by a less degree of messianism and a greater facility in adopting new ideas. Decadent poets. Some acquaintance with this new variety of literary madman will explain to us the existence in the 17th century of the French précaut, and at the present day that of the Parnassiens, Symbolistes, and the Decadents. I have read their verses, say Lemaitre, and not even seen as much as the turkey in the fable, who, if he did not distinguish very well, at least saw something. I have been able to make nothing of these series of words, which, being connected together according to the laws of syntax, might be supposed to have some sense, and have none, and which spitefully keep your mind on the stretch in a vacuum, like a conundrum without an answer. Anta dentelle oen nesnator, mundu evanescement, traisons pour l'être sans histoire, tel vous de livres resumant, tout ombre hors d'un territoire, setente iterativement, et la lueur excellatoire, despetelles le remnant. One of them, however, has explained to us what they intend doing, in a pamphlet mostly entitled Traits du Verbe, by Stéphane Mallarmé. By this it appears that they have invented two things, the symbol and the poetic instrumentation. The invention of the symbolist seems to consist in not saying what feelings, thoughts, or states of mind they express by images, but even this is not new. A symbol is, in short, an enlarged comparison of which only the second term is given, a connected series of metaphors. Briefly, the symbol is the old allegory of our fathers. Now here is a second discovery made by our wild-eyed symbolists. Men have suspected ever since Homer's time that there are relations, correspondences, affinities between certain sounds, forms, and colours, and certain states of mind. For instance, it was felt that the repeated sound of A had something to do with the impression of freshness and peace produced by this line of Virgil. Pascetur in silva magna formosa juvenca. It was known that sounds may, like colours, be striking or subdued, like feelings sad or joyful, but it was thought that these resemblances and relations are somewhat figurative, having nothing constant or sharply defined, and that they are, at least, hinted at by the sense of the words which compose a musical phrase. Now attend to this, for the gentleman. A equals black, E equals white, I equals blue, O equals red, U equals yellow. Again, black equals the organ, white equals the harp, blue equals the violin, red equals the trumpet, yellow equals the flute. Again, the organ expresses monotony, doubt, and simplicity, the harp, serenity, the violin, passion and prayer, the trumpet, glory and ovation, the flute, smiles and ingenuousness. It is difficult to make out to what degree the young symbolists still take account of the sense of words. That degree, however, is in any case very slight, and for my part, I cannot well distinguish the passages where they are obscure from those where they are only unintelligible. In short, a poetry without thoughts, at once primitive and subtle, which does not, like classic poetry, express a connected series of ideas, nor like the poetry of the Parnassiens, the physical world in its exact outlines, but states of mind in which we can scarcely distinguish ourselves from surrounding objects, where sensation is so closely united in sentiment, or that it grows so rapidly and naturally out of the former, that it is quite sufficient for us to note down our sensations about them just as they present themselves, to express ipso facto the emotions which they successively give rise to in the mind. Do you understand? Neither do I. One would have to be drunk in order to understand this. I can only conceive that the poetry and attempt to find which has here been made could be that of a solitary, a nerve sufferer, and almost a madman. This poetry thus flourishes on the borderland between reason and madness. Yet these Mattoids have their man of genius. Verlaine. Let us hear Lemaitre on this subject. I imagine he must be almost illiterate. He has a strange head, the profile of Socrates, an enormous forehead, a skull knobbed like a battered basin of thin copper. He is not civilized, he ignores all received codes of morality. One day he disappears. What has become of him? It would be in character for him to have been publicly cast out from regular society. I see him behind the gate of a prison like Francois Villon, not for having, like him, become an accomplice of thieves and rogues for the love of a free life, but rather for an error of over-sensitiveness, for having avenged, by an involuntary stab, given as it were in a dream, a love reprobated by laws and customs of the modern and western world. But though socially degraded, he remains innocent. He repents as simply as he sinned, with a Catholic repentance, all term tenderness, without reasoning, without pride of intellect. In his conversion, as in his sin, he remains a purely emotional being. Then it may be a woman took pity on him, and he let himself be led like a little child. He reappears, but continues to live apart. No one has ever seen him on the boulevards, or in a theatre, or at the salon. He is somewhere at the other end of Paris, in the back room of a wine merchant shop, drinking blue wine. He is as far from us as if he were an innocent satyr in the great forests. When he is ill or at the end of his resources, some doctor whom he knew formerly, when in jail, gets him into the hospital. He stays there as long as he can and writes verses. He hears queer, sad songs whispered to him out of the folds of the cold white calico curtains. He is not déclassé, for he never had a class. His case is rare and peculiar. He finds means to live in a civilized society as he could live in a state of the freest nature. It may be that he has sometimes felt, for instance, the influence of some contemporary poets, but these have done nothing for him, save to wake and reveal him to the extreme and painful sensibility which is his whole being. In the main he is without a master. He molds language at his will, not like a great writer because he knows it, but like a child because he is ignorant of it. He gives wrong sense to words in his simplicity. Little as we might expect it, this poet, whom his disciples regard as such a consummate artist, writes on occasion, if we may dare to speak out, like a pupil of the technical schools, or a second-rate chemist subject to lyric outbursts. After this, it is amusing to see him, while posing as the implacable artist, the sculptor of strophes, the gentleman who distrusts imagination, write with the keenest sense of enjoyment. A nos qui cesselons les mots comme des coupes, et qui fassions des vers emus tres froidement, secul nos faute, a nous est auxiliaires des lamps, la science conquise et le sommeil dompte. Yet this writer, so wanting in ordinary technical skill, as he had written, I cannot tell how, verses of a penetrating sweetness, a languid charm which is peculiarly his own, and which perhaps arises from union of these things, charm of sound, clearness of feeling, and partial obscurity in the words. Thus when he tells us that he is dreaming of an unknown woman who loves him, who understands him, and weeps with him, he adds, Son nom, je me souviens que est la douce et sonore, comme sous des aims que la vers exila. Son regard est préval au regard des statues, et pour s'avouer l'entwain, et calme, et grave, elle a l'inflexion des voix chères qui se sont tous. I am very fond of the chanson d'automne, though certain words, blême and suffocant, are not perhaps used with entire accuracy, and scarcely correspond with the languor described just before. Les sanglots longs des virons de l'automne blessent mon cœur de une langueur monotone, tout suffocante et blême quand sonne la hue. Je me souviens des jours anciens et je pleure, et je la mauvaise, ou votre mauvaise, qui m'importe de cardela, parella à la foule morte. He celebrates the Virgin in an exceedingly fine hymn. Je ne veux plus aimer quima miel mari, et comige etas faible et bien méchant encore. Oxmain laches les yeux éblouis des shamans, et les passer mes yeux, et me jongent les mains. Et me insigne les mots per les quais en adore. Et tous ces bons efforts versus croix et le case, comige invoquois, el insignet mes reins. His pity inspires him with some very sweet lines. Écoutez la chanson bien douce, qui ne pleurer quel pour vous plaire. Elle est discrète, elle est légère. Un frisson de yo sœur de la moussu. Elle dit la voix reconnue, qui bibont est notre vie, qui de la haine est la envie, reine est la mort venue. Alcoolise la voix qui persiste, dans son naïf épithalame, allez reines malheur l'âme, qui diffère en la mort triste. Je ne me souviens plus, qui tout le me font le fait. Dans tous les mouvements bizarres de ma vie, de mes malheurs, selon me la émet et le lieu, des auteurs et de moi, de la route vie, j'ai en rien retenu qui le grâce Dieu. But even in the poem's Saturnines, we already meet with pieces of an oddity difficult to define, pieces which seem to belong to a poet who is slightly mad, or perhaps to one who is only half awake, and whose brain is darkened by the fumes of his dreams, or of drink, so external objects only appear to him through a mist, and the indolence of his memory prevents him from getting hold of the right words. Take this for an example. La lune plaqueret ses tens de zinc, parangas obtus, des bouts de fumée en forme de zinc, sortain intrus et noirs, des hoods toits pointus. Le ciel était gris, la bise pleurait. Ainsi qu'un basson, à lune matour felix descrit. Malouette de étrage aigre facon, moi j'alis revant du divin Platon, et di Phidias, et di Salamine et di Marathon, sut le all cling notat des blues becs de gaz. That is all. What is it? It is an impression. The impression of a gentleman who walks about the streets of Paris at night, and thinks about Plateau and Salamis, and thinks it funny to think of Plateau and Salamis sus hors des becs de gaz. Why should it be funny? I cannot tell. Aimes donc la raison que toujours vos écrits, imprudent de elle sur le illustre et le brix. One might almost say that Paul Verlaine is the only poet who has never expressed anything but sentimental sensation as expressed them for himself and for no one else, which dispenses him from the obligation of showing the connection between his ideas, since he knows it. This poet never asked himself whether he should be understood, and he has never wished to prove anything. This is why, Sagaz accepted, it is almost impossible to give a resume of his collections, or to state their main idea in an efficient form. One can only characterize them by means of the state of mind of which they are most frequently the rendering. Semi-intoxication, hallucination which distorts objects and makes them resemble in a incoherent dream. Uneasiness of the soul which, in the terror of this mystery, complains like a child. The languor, mystic sweetness, and a lulling of the mind to rest. In the Catholic conception of the universe accepted in all simplicity. There is something profoundly involuntarily and illogical in the poetry of M. Paul Verlaine. He scarcely ever expresses movements in full consciousness or entire sanity. It is on this account, very often, that the meaning of his song is clear, if it is so at all, to himself alone. In the same way, his rhythms are sometimes perceptible by no one but himself. I do not infer here to the interlaced feminine rhymes, alliterations, assonances within the line itself, of which none is made us more frequently or more successfully than he. But there are two sides to him. On one he looks very artificial. He has an ars poetica of his own, which is entirely subtle and mysterious, and which I think he was very late in discovering. De la musique avant toute chose, et pour cela préférer l'impérial, place vague place sous le beau dans l'air, sans rien et l'eau qui presque au compose. Il faut aussi que tourner les ponts. Choisir tes mots sans quelque méprise. Rien de plus cher que la chanson grise. Ou les indices au persistent, quand nos volons à nos encore. passe la couleur rinquillanos, o al nos seriofaians, l'erveur orvev et la flûte cor. On the other side he is quite simple. Jesus venu cam orphelin. Reach de melsues des tranquilles, versa homes des grands villes. Les ne m'en pas trouve malin. Or elsewhere, j'ai parfois de un basier, quand tu un habiel, je souffre et je vil, sans me reposer, j'ai impure de un basier. It will be seen that the decadents correspond exactly to the diagnosis of literary Mattoids, in all their old vacuity, but with the appearance of novelty. At the same time, there are among them real men of genius who, amid the frequently atavistic oddities of Mattoidism, have struck an original note. All these cases show us that the gradations and transitions between sanity and insanity are far from being as hypothetical as Livy asserts them to be. Moreover, all this is in perfect harmony with the internal evolution which we see going on in the ample realm of nature, which, as has been well said, never proceeds by leaps, but by successive and gradual transformations. Now it is natural that, as these gradations exist in this very strange form of literary insanity, they should also be found in the forms of criminal insanity, and that, in consequence, many of those asserted to be guilty or mad are only half responsible, although no human thought can trace the limits with entire certainty. It is well to observe here what a different appearance madness assumes, according to the age in which it occurs. Had Bosisio lived in the Middle Ages, or in Spain or Mexico at a later period, the kind-hearted liberator of birds, the martyr for posterity, would have become Ezechia or Torquemada, the positivist atheist and ultra-Catholic, commanded by a cruel deity to immolate human victims. But Bosisio was an Italian living in 1870. This case affords an excellent explanation of the occurrence in remote times and among savage or slightly civilized nations of numerous outbreaks of epidemic insanity, and shows that many historical events may have been the results of mania on the part of one or more persons. Cases in point are those of the Anabaptists, the Flagellants, the Witch Mania, the Taiping Revolution. Mental aberration gives rise in some men to ideas which, though bizarre, are sometimes gigantic and rendered more efficacious by a singular force of conviction, so as to sweep along the feeble-minded multitude, who are all the more attracted by any singularity in dress, attitudes, or abstinence, which such disease alone can suggest and render it possible. That these phenomena are made inexplicable to them, and therefore worthy of veneration, by their ignorance and barbarism. The ignorant man always adores what he cannot understand. Our poor sufferer from hallucinations wanted nothing but a favourable epoch to impress his ideas on the multitude. Neither muscular strength, nor a certain vigour of thought, nor extraordinary endurance under privations, nor disinterestedness, nor conviction. In another epoch, Italy would have found her Mahomet in Bosisio. Mattoids in art. A competition opened in Rome for designs for a proposed monument to Victor Emmanuel. The subject being an international one, Mattoids came forward in crowds. In fact, we find in Dossier's curious book no less than 39 out of 296, 13%, a number which would be raised to 25% if we add 38 more, who in addition to their eccentricity gave tokens of being imbecile. The most general characteristic of these productions is their stupidity. One of them proposes a square stone box without a roof, similar to the magnaneries or roofless stone buildings used in the south of France for silkworms, which he calls a right quadrangular tower, destined to receive the late king's remains and protect them against the inundations of the Tiber. Tris, monument, destined to live for centuries, consists of a column surrounded by obelisks, by 4 flights of steps and 4 triangles, each surrounded by 12 small spires. Each of the latter is to support a bust. Each of the columns a statue of some great Italian. With regard to 6 statues, the artist reserves the right of changing them at the death of our illustrious men, Sella, Namaendi, etc. This is a case of saying, perish the astrologer. Another competitor, 2 in fact, have rejected rooms to serve as public lavatories to the base of their columns. There's a curious coincidence and emulation of hatred in nearly all. Most of them make use of celebrated monuments, whose destruction is, of course, in sine qua non to the erection of theirs. But if wanting in every sign of genius, these designs are not deficient in allegorical symbols of the most grotesque type, or in inscriptions. Some of them indeed are nothing but a mass of irrelevant inscriptions, relating to everything in the world except the poor Re Galantuomo himself, but more particularly to the supposed genius of the artist. Here we find the main characteristic of such minds: vanity, heightened to the point of disease, makes each of them think his own production a masterpiece. Canfor declares that he is neither engineer nor architect, but inspired by God alone. A.B. does not send his design to the committee because it is too grand, and another ends by saying, "How mighty is the thought of the artist." Nearly all are absolutely ignorant of the art in which they claim to excel. Thus Dossier found among the projectors teachers of mathematics and of grammar, doctors in medicine and in law, military men, accountants, and others who themselves assert that they had never before handled pencil or compasses. At the same time, their far from humble social position bears out what I consider to be one of the principal points, viz., that we have before us, as might be suspected, idiots, or persons actually insane, but men quite respectable outside their special artistic mania. Such should be M., a member of the Russian Archaeological Society of the Hellenic Silage, architect-in-chief of Rumelia and the palaces of the Sultan, knight, and a commander of various orders, etc., etc. When we compare these stupid abortions with the pictures inspired by insanity, I am now speaking of those painters who, like various poets and musicians, in losing their reason, lost artistically more than they gained, especially the right proportion and the harmony of colour. We shall often find the absurd and disproportionate, but also at the same time a true, even excessive originality, mingled with a savage beauty sui generis, which, up to a certain point, recalls the masterpieces of medieval, and still more, of Chinese and Japanese art, so extraordinarily rich in symbols. We shall see, in short, that art suffers here, not from a defect, but from an excess of genius, which ends by crushing itself. In conclusion, it is very evident that the insane artist is as superior to the Mattoid in the practice of his art, as he is inferior to him in practical life. That, in short, in the region of art, the Mattoid approaches nearer to the imbecile and the lunatic to the man of genius. End of section 12.